Have you ever wondered why some perceptions have persisted throughout history? Why were Black Africans viewed with distrust, fear, or even hostility? Join us on a mission to find the answers as to why Black Africans were viewed as threats. What caused these perceptions? How did they influence the course of events? And most importantly, what can we learn from them? Prepare to delve deep into the past and discover secret truths that still resonate in our world today. Black Africans have historically been viewed as threats by many different nations, especially in the wake of slavery and colonialism. This view has long-lasting effects because it is firmly anchored in intricate historical, social, and cultural settings. This attitude was largely shaped by economic competition, which was fostered by the idea that African economic superiority would challenge European dominance. In addition to seeking economic advantage, European nations expanded their cultural influence and strengthened their geopolitical dominance by launching colonial conquests in Africa during the 19th century. However, beneath the surface of economic and political ambitions were deeply ingrained racial stereotypes that characterized Black Africans as inferior and uncivilized. These prejudices were deeply embedded in European civilizations, molded by centuries of ethnocentrism and ideas of racial supremacy. Racial hierarchies were established from the first contacts between Europeans and Africans, with Europeans ascending to the top and Africans falling to the bottom. This racial hierarchy provided a handy pretext for colonial invasion and exploitation, as Europeans perceived themselves to be intrinsically superior and hence entitled to dominate and control African territories and people. However, this sense of superiority was not the result of European hubris. Rather, it was purposefully developed and perpetuated through a variety of ways, including religion, science, and culture. The Christian notion of divine providence and the so-called civilizing mission were used to legitimize European expansionism and colonialism by portraying them as benevolent efforts to bring culture and Christianity to uncivilized peoples. Similarly, scientific ideologies such as social Darwinism were used to justify racial hierarchies by claiming that European civilization represented the peak of human achievement and that other races, notably Africans, were biologically inferior and destined for subjugation. These racist views were further reinforced by cultural representations, literature, and art that portrayed Africans as primitive, strange, and inherently dangerous. Thus, by the time European countries began their colonial expansion into Africa, the view of Black Africans as threats had become thoroughly embedded in the collective consciousness of European societies. European colonial expansion into Africa in the 19th century was driven by a convergence of economic, political, and geopolitical objectives, as European countries sought to utilize the continent's rich resources and broaden their domains of influence. However, these objectives were rooted in deeply ingrained racial attitudes that dehumanized and marginalized Black Africans. European colonists saw themselves as culturally and racially superior, justifying their invasions by depicting Africans as primitive and in need of civilization. This impression was reinforced by the ideology of social Darwinism, which held that European culture was fundamentally superior and destined to conquer lesser races. As a result, colonial powers rationalized their exploitation and enslavement of African peoples as a civilizing mission, hiding their imperialist aims under a veneer of moral righteousness. These racial prejudices not only aided the exploitation of Africa's riches, but also created the framework for centuries of systemic racism and oppression, which continue to impact global dynamics to this day. The scramble for Africa, as it is commonly known to, saw European countries divide the continent among themselves, defining artificial frontiers that ignored pre-existing ethnic, cultural, and political lines. This arbitrary split of Africa intensified existing tensions and conflicts among African communities, while also reinforcing European domination and exploitation. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, in which European countries met to establish their territorial claims in Africa, exemplified a contempt for African sovereignty and self-determination. Instead, African peoples were seen as mere subordinates to be separated and dominated by European powers, strengthening the idea of their inferiority and disposability. Furthermore, the colonial endeavor in Africa was characterized by widespread violence, exploitation, and dispossession. European colonists utilized force and pressure to subdue African peoples, violently suppressing any resistance to their authority. This violence was not limited to the colonial period. It persisted well into the post-colonial era, as African states sought to assert their independence and sovereignty against entrenched colonial interests. The legacy of colonialism continues to plague Africa today as the continent deals with the long-term effects of exploitation, underdevelopment, and political instability. Despite gaining legal independence, many African countries are nonetheless economically dependent on former colonial powers, stuck in a cycle of poverty and underdevelopment. Furthermore, the social and political inequalities caused by colonialism continue to fuel disputes and tensions across the continent, impeding efforts toward unification and prosperity. In this way, the image of Black Africans as threats was both a result of and a driving force behind colonialism, as European powers sought to legitimize their invasion and exploitation of the continent by presenting Africans as innately inferior and uncivilized.
It was still a very new and sensational technique, with photos suddenly being available in color.
For the viewer, a color photo feels much closer than a black and white one.
These racist concepts were central to colonial propaganda, penetrating numerous parts of society and justifying African people's exploitation and subjugation. European colonial powers used these beliefs to justify their dominance over African countries, portraying themselves as beneficent civilizers and Africans as savages and uncivilized. Such depictions were not restricted to colonial propaganda. They were also embedded in educational curriculum and cultural representations, solidifying unfavorable attitudes of Africans in the collective consciousness of European societies. Furthermore, the spread of negative images and narratives in literature, art, and media reinforced notions of African inferiority, hence justifying colonial violence and exploitation. By degrading Africans and portraying them as intrinsically dangerous, colonial powers justified the imposition of harsh laws and the suppression of resistance activities, continuing a cycle of systematic racism and exploitation that still affects African countries today. Dehumanization of Africans was more than just a rhetorical or ideological construct. It had real and tragic effects for millions of Africans who faced brutality, exploitation, and dispossession. The cruel treatment of African peoples during the colonial period, ranging from forced labor and land expropriation to mass bloodshed and genocide, demonstrates colonialism's degrading influence on African societies. Furthermore, the legacy of colonialism continues to impact contemporary views and opinions of Africans, as preconceptions and biases developed during this time persist today. Despite the formal end of colonial control, the ideology of superiority and entitlement that underpins colonialism persists, creating inequalities and injustices throughout Africa and around the world. Recognizing and tackling this legacy is critical to resolving the underlying causes of racism and inequality and creating a more just and equitable society for all.
The true blue, effect that, basically the Brits did things the right way.
The Mau Mau Uprising is an armed freedom movement that takes place in Kenya in the 1950s. It is one of the most violent armed struggles in the British Empire.
The portrayal of Black Africans as threats served to justify the violent and oppressive tactics employed by colonial powers. By dehumanizing Africans, colonial authorities could justify their exploitation and subjugation, perpetuating the belief in African inferiority to morally justify the brutality of colonial rule. This perception persisted beyond the colonial era, shaping attitudes and policies towards African diaspora communities in Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere. The legacy of colonialism continues to cast a long shadow over global politics and society, as the inequalities and injustices created by centuries of exploitation and oppression persist. Recognizing and confronting this legacy is essential for building a more just and equitable world, where all peoples are treated with dignity, respect, and equality. Overcoming these deeply rooted biases requires sustained efforts to challenge societal norms, promote diversity and inclusion, enact policies that address systemic injustices, and foster dialogue and understanding among all communities.
Led by several ethnic groups who were unhappy with the policies of German colonial authorities and their attempts to force labor and taxation on local populations. The rebellion was named after the
resistance and repression against colonialism reinforced colonial rulers' perceptions of African violence and brutality. The mere act of expressing autonomy or defying colonial authority resulted in disproportionate action, reinforcing the perception that African populations pose an inherent threat. Colonial authorities used propaganda to demonize resistance movements, portraying them as acts of terrorism or barbarism rather than legitimate struggles for freedom and self-determination. Increased surveillance and punitive measures were adopted not merely to suppress immediate resistance, but also to create fear and subordination in African communities. These strategies not only perpetuated colonial dominance, but also solidified the idea of Black Africans as constant threats to European authority, adding to the long-standing legacy of institutional racism and oppression. Despite enormous odds and ruthless persecution, Africans opposed colonial control in a variety of methods, including armed uprisings, guerrilla warfare, political organizing, and cultural resistance. These acts of resistance were not isolated instances. They were part of a larger struggle for liberty, dignity, and self-determination. They questioned colonial rule's legitimacy and asserted African peoples' agency and humanity, inspiring future generations of activists and freedom fighters worldwide. Furthermore, resistance organizations were essential in alerting the international community to colonialism's violence and cruelty, hence generating support for decolonization and anti-imperialist campaigns. While colonial powers frequently presented African resistance as acts of cruelty or barbarism, the truth was considerably more complex and nuanced, reflecting the colonial system's deeply ingrained injustices and disparities. In this way, resistance to colonial rule not only challenged the idea of Africans as threats, but also paved the way for the eventual collapse of colonial empires and the formation of independent African nations. The transatlantic slave trade, which lasted centuries, was fueled by a demand for labor in the Americas, particularly in industries like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. European traders justified African enslavement by promoting racist notions that portrayed Black people as subhuman and undeserving of basic rights and dignity. Enslaved Africans were dehumanized by severe treatment, including as physical assault, forced work, and separation from their family. reinforcing the belief that they were inherently inferior. Enslaved Africans' dehumanization not only aided their exploitation, but it also normalized and justified the violence and cruelty perpetrated by slave owners and traders. Furthermore, the legacy of slavery lives on, since the trauma and systemic injustices experienced by African descendants continue to shape racial dynamics and inequality in modern nations. The transatlantic slave trade was not only a crime against humanity, but it also represented a deep violation of the ideas of equality and fairness that underpin modern civilization. It established the groundwork for decades of racial injustice and oppression, reinforcing stereotypes and prejudices that still influence attitudes and behaviors toward Black communities today. Furthermore, the economic legacy of slavery continues to benefit slave owners and traffickers' descendants, sustaining inequalities and disparities in wealth and opportunities over generations. Recognizing and confronting this legacy is essential for addressing the root causes of racial injustice and building a more just and equitable society for all.
Deliberate deception.
These cases are presented to the Ministry of Legal Affairs in Kenya, the Attorney General, but they then go into
The institution of slavery was based on the belief that Black Africans were inherently inferior and thus posed a threat to the social order if left unchecked. Slave owners attempted to maintain power by reducing them to mere commodities, suppressing any possible opposition. Fear of slave rebellions and uprisings was widespread among slave-owning civilizations, prompting the implementation of harsh laws and surveillance systems to keep enslaved populations under control. Despite these attempts, resistance to slavery was widespread and persistent, with enslaved Africans claiming humanity and dignity in the face of terrible persecution. From slave revolts and escape attempts to daily acts of resistance and sabotage, enslaved Africans resisted their servitude in a variety of ways, questioning the validity of the institution and encouraging future generations of abolitionists and freedom fighters. Furthermore, the legacy of slavery continues to impact contemporary views and perceptions of race, as preconceptions and biases developed during this time remain relevant today. Recognizing and facing this legacy is critical to establishing a fair and equitable society in which all people are treated with decency, respect, and equality.
The U.S. government enters Reconstruction with 3 amendments to the Constitution. Slavery is abolished, and former slaves are granted citizenship and the right to vote. At the state and local level, white Southern Democrats implement laws to suppress the political and economic gains made by African Americans. Under the Separate but Equal Clause, the U.S. Supreme Court legitimizes segregation and social discrimination, treating Black people as second-class citizens. Known collectively as Jim Crow laws, after a racial depiction performed in blackface.
Even after slavery was abolished, racial prejudices persisted, manifested in many forms of institutionalized discrimination. The Jim Crow laws, which were mostly implemented in the southern United States, enforced racial segregation and institutionalized discrimination against African Americans, reinforcing the image of Black inferiority and inherent threat. These laws essentially disenfranchised African Americans by denying them the same public services, education, and economic opportunities as white residents. The segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans created the notion that they were intrinsically dangerous, as if their presence undermined the social order and white dominance. Furthermore, discriminatory actions like voter suppression and racially biased policing fueled the perception of African Americans as threats, increasing systemic inequalities and injustice. Even beyond legal segregation, widespread social views maintained the belief that Black people are inherently menacing or inferior. These profoundly established prejudices persisted throughout the Jim Crow era, permeating many parts of daily life and perpetuating institutional disparities. Discriminatory tactics such as redlining in housing, unequal access to healthcare, and inequities in employment possibilities reinforced the idea of Black Africans as threats to be marginalized or controlled. Furthermore, the portrayal of African Americans in media and popular culture frequently reinforced negative stereotypes, which contributed to the persistence of discriminatory attitudes and practices. Overcoming these deeply ingrained biases necessitates ongoing efforts to challenge established norms, promote diversity and inclusion, and implement legislation that address structural injustice. The 20th century civil rights movement represented a watershed moment in the fight against ingrained racial biases and systemic discrimination against Black communities. The movement, led by courageous activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, worked ceaselessly for equal rights, desegregation, and the abolition of institutionalized racism. Despite historic successes such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the history of centuries of oppression continues to cast a long shadow over contemporary attitudes of Black Africans. Despite legal and societal advancements, racial biases and stereotypes still exist in many forms, impacting attitudes and behaviors toward Black communities. These biases are maintained by media representation, cultural narratives, and institutionalized discrimination, which contribute to persistent racial inequities in school, employment, healthcare, and the criminal justice system. As a result, while progress has been achieved toward equality, the fight to eliminate systematic racism and achieve true social justice continues. Understanding the historical foundations of racial stereotypes against Black Africans is critical for overcoming systematic racism. Centuries of colonialism, slavery, and imperialism have reinforced negative stereotypes and opinions of Black people as inferior or menacing. These biases persist in a variety of ways, including discriminatory law enforcement activities and the disproportionate targeting of Black neighborhoods for monitoring and examination. Combating these established stereotypes requires a diverse approach that includes education, legislative measures, and community engagement. By recognizing and confronting the past injustices that have produced these views, societies can begin the process of healing and reconciliation. Individuals, institutions, and governments must actively confront discriminatory attitudes and policies in order to create a more equitable and inclusive future for all. To summarize, the historical idea of Black Africans as threats was profoundly founded in the legacies of colonialism, enslavement, and widespread racial prejudice. The exploitation and dehumanization of African peoples during these periods established the groundwork for long-lasting prejudices and discriminatory attitudes that continue to this day. Recognizing and comprehending this history is critical for confronting and destroying the systematic racism that continues to plague countries around the world. Recognizing the historical roots of racial discrimination and oppression allows us to work toward a more inclusive and equitable future in which all people, regardless of race or ethnicity, are treated with dignity, respect, and justice. Only by working together to tackle persistent biases and systematic injustices can we hope to create a truly just and equitable society for everyone. If you found this video informative, don't forget to give it a like and leave a comment. What surprised you the most about what you learned? Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content, and be sure to share this video with your friends. Stay tuned for our upcoming videos and catch up on our previous ones if you haven't already. Your support means everything. See you in the next one. Bye.